Good morning. We're talking about the seventh sense. When we speak about five senses, sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, when we talk about a sixth sense, good movie, we refer to one that exists outside the realm of science, or one that doesn't exist in most humans. We're going to talk about a seventh sense. And by the seventh sense, we talk about the human spirit, the means by which we conceive of and connect with God. And this morning, we're going to make an important distinction between the default human spirit and the upgraded human spirit. We're going to review first, let's review what we've learned about the default human spirit. Maybe, here we go. The default human spirit distances us from God. We experience the default human spirit as a voice of accusation and indictment. And what we looked at was in the Garden of Eden. And you remember, Adam, when God came walking in the garden in the cool of the day, he took off and ended up hiding behind a bush. And God said, "Where are you?" And Adam said, "I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And then God asked him a question that helps us to zero in on what does the human spirit do anyways? Who told you you were naked? And what we looked at, well, there's only so many people there at the time, not a big cast of characters. It could be either God, Satan, Adam, Eve, and Satan is the serpent. God didn't tell him. He wouldn't have asked him if he had told him. Satan didn't tell him. Who told Adam that he was naked? He told himself. And we experienced the human spirit as a voice within, ate fruit from the tree, and then what happened next? What happened next, he says, something inside of him says, "Don't look now, but..." And that's the way we experience the human spirit, as a voice of indictment and a voice of allegation. We don't need angels on our shoulders. You've seen that thing, right? The good angel, the bad angel. We don't need that. We've got him inside. I don't need angels perched on this side and angels perched on this side. All of us have a running dialogue in our mind. Our voices accusing and defending us. And if it's not inside, it comes from outside. We don't have to look for a message of indictment. They come looking for us. And we looked at Job. Remember Job's friends? He was in enough trouble. And there was Eliphaz. He was one of the friends. He had a vision. And he had a vision. He ended up telling this vision to Job about this appearance that happened. And then he ends up reminding Job of what the vision said. And then his friend Bildad ended up taking the same vision. And let me refresh your thinking. Here's what happens to God as the first telling of the vision, and then the second telling, and then the third. I'll tell you what happens to God, and then I'll tell you what happens to man. Okay, in the first instance of this in Job 4, it says, God places no trust in his servants if he charges his angels with error. So God charges even angels with error. Then the second thing, God places no trust in his holy ones. Even the heavens aren't pure in his eyes. And the third, even the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in his eyes. God becomes increasingly perfectionistic. And look what happens to man. In the first vision, the first telling of it, man, those who live in houses of clay, whose foundations are in the dust, who are crushed more readily than a moth. So in the beginning, we're moths who are crushed readily. Then it goes, man who is vile and corrupt, who drinks up evil like water. So we start off being crushed like moths, then we end up vile and corrupt, and then in the third telling, we turn into maggots. Man who is but a maggot. The son of man who is only a worm. What happens? And this shows us what happens under the impact of the human spirit. God becomes increasingly perfectionistic, and man becomes maggots. And the distance between us and God grows. That's the impact of the human spirit. Distances us from God. The impact of the default spirit. You follow your natural default logic, and God will be in one part of the universe, and you'll be in the other. That's just the way it works. The default human spirit divides us from ourselves as well. You remember what happened. He hid. Then Adam ended up doing this. He said, The man said, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit for the tree, and I ate it." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What have you done? The serpent deceived me, and I ate." We saw a clip of a couple monkeys on Easter. And you remember the cucumber? He fired the cucumber at the guy. So what Adam ends up doing, he fires the cucumber at Eve. That's her fault. Bam. And then Eve, who's she going to fire it at? She doesn't fire it at God. She fires it at the serpent. It's his fault. Bam. Hits him. And so what it does, the default human spirit not only divides us from God, it divides us from ourselves. Internally, we distance from ourselves and with one another. Let's talk about the divine spirit then. Talk about the divine spirit. There we go. The divine spirit upgrades the human spirit. The divine spirit upgrades the human spirit. You understand when we talk about upgrade, naturally. All of us understand computer by this time. It's when we get the latest technology, the latest software, the latest stuff that allows our computers to run efficiently. God upgrades the human spirit, and it makes sense why. Because do you remember what the human spirit does? Remember the two things? Distances us from him, divides us from one another. And it needs an upgrade. And that's what the divine spirit does. Look what it says. 1 Corinthians 2. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the man's spirit within him? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. We have not received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. This is what we speak, not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, expressing spiritual truths in spiritual words. The man without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. And he cannot understand them because they are spiritually discerned. The Spirit reveals God's deep thoughts. It says the Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. You're saying, Mike, what in the world is that? That is a bathysphere. A bathysphere. And a bathysphere is a vehicle, it's a marine vehicle that allows you to go deep into the water and see what's around. Now, the reason why I point that out is the bathos. It's a Greek word. It talks about what's beneath the surface. And that's what it says, is the Spirit searches out the bathos of God. See, we might look at God and think we know him, but beneath the surface, in the inner part of God, there are things, deep things, that you need a bathysphere to be able to discern. The Spirit is the bathysphere. He's the one that tells us what is deep within God. The Spirit reveals the thoughts that lie deep below the surface. And when we're viewing the depths of God's thoughts, the things we see swimming around are lots of free gifts. The deeper you get into God and what he actually thinks beneath the surface, the more you see free gifts floating around. Because frankly, God doesn't need anything from you. And again, on the surface, God takes our service and our money and our stuff and uses them. But you get deep within the being of God, he doesn't need us. That's why what you see swimming around, what you see deep within God is lots of free gifts, because he's God. He existed eternally. He brings this into being so that he might reveal the things that he wants to give us. Look what it says in that verse. We have not received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God. I want you to look and see what this says. Here's what it says. We haven't received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might know what? If you hear the Spirit of God, what is he going to tell you? It says that we may understand what God has freely given us. Do you see what that's saying? How can you tell the difference between the spirit of the world and the Spirit who is from God? The spirit of the world will tell you about things you have to pay for with God. You have to pay your way. The Spirit who is from God won't bring that message. He tells you the things that God freely gives. Why is Paul telling us this? Why is he telling the Corinthians this? That's who he wrote to first. He's telling them so that they will know who to listen to. See, the problem is there's all kinds of messages out there. Job had all kinds of messages. We have all kinds of messages as well. Here's the question. You ready for this? How can you tell if somebody's representing God accurately? That's a good question, right? They do a bunch of miracles. Is that proof positive that somebody speaks for God? How about if they are passionate? They really mean what they say and they're sincere? Is that proof positive? It's a good question, isn't it? Because when we hear people talk about God, we get a lot of different messages, don't we? People act a lot of different ways, say a lot of different things. Here's the question, how can we know? And this is what Paul is saying. He says this is the way you can determine if it's a God thing or not. If it's a God thing, you hear about free gifts and you walk out feeling somewhat lighter. You don't feel like that's the way it feels. You learn about free gifts. When it's not God, there's a sense of heaviness. Things that you have to buy, pay for. Things you have to do. That's what it says. This is what we speak, not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, expressing spiritual truths and spiritual words. The man without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, for they're foolishness to him. He cannot understand them because they're spiritually discerned. You know what's really hard for us? Free gifts. Free gifts is difficult. If God says to you, you can be accepted by me, and we say, okay, what do I have to do? Give me 10 things, give me 15 things. God says you have to believe. You have to believe that I give free gifts. I think that's really hard for us. It's hard for us not to be able to do anything to pay our way. I mean, nothing in life is free, is it? Except when you explore the bathos of God, the things underneath the surface in God, and then you find out there's free gifts that are available to those who believe. And that's what the Bible indicates. It's an important verse, again, as we continue to chase. How do we know if it's the Spirit of God or not? Look what it says in Romans 8, 15 and 16. You do not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received a spirit of sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. We learn a couple critical things here. The focus of God's Spirit and the nature of the Spirit's influence. Now, here's what we're going to find out. The Spirit speaks, reveals things to us. What part of us? We are flesh, being really simple, flesh and spirit. Flesh is the part that you can touch. Spirit is the part you can't touch. And we're defining spirit as that part that connects with God. Here's a question. What does the Spirit focus on? Does the Spirit yell at our fleshly thoughts and says, snap in it, snap to it, get with it? Is that what the Spirit does? Tells you when you're doing things wrong, you better stop it. You better not do that. And he could. A lot of people indicate that's what the Spirit says. When you feel bad about something and convicted about sin, that's the Spirit of God. Is that what the Spirit speaks to? Or does he speak to the Spirit? In our human spirit. Do you remember the two things the human spirit does? Do you remember that? Distances us from God, divides us from others. Does the Spirit of God speak to our flesh or to our spirit? What do you think? Good question, isn't it? You know what he speaks to? Well, look what it says. The Spirit himself, Romans 8:16, look what it says. Ready? The Spirit himself testifies with our... Do you know what the Spirit says? The Spirit speaks to that part of you that conceives of God. And what he says to that part, don't be afraid. Shh. God wants to be your father, not your master. You are to be his child, not his slave. The Spirit speaks to that part of you that conceives of God as, and you know what he says? Be quiet. He's not your enemy. He wants you to be your father. He wants you to be his child. That's who the Spirit speaks to. You know what he wants to do? Upgrade your spirit. That part of you that distances from God and divides from others. Under the influence of the Spirit, the opposite happens. You end up drawing close to God. And guess what happens when you draw close to God? You draw closer to his children. Huh. That's how that works. Huh. We're supposed to love each other. Okay, so if we become closer to him, we become closer to one another. You know what's interesting? If you picture, get a triangle. Can you picture a triangle with me? God, you and me. Okay? God, you and me. Okay. How am I going to draw closer to you? I could try to go this way, but you know what's going to happen? If you and I draw closer to God, now watch this. This is going to be amazing now. Okay? It's just going to be, you're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you right now. It's just you have absolutely no idea where this is going. No idea. God, you, and me. Okay, what's going to happen if we draw closer to God? Mike, that's amazing. That's astonishing. If you hadn't showed me that, I wouldn't have believed it. Yeah, what's the deal? You draw closer to one another, and it's automatic. That's why the Spirit tells us that God's our Father, because the closer we draw to Him, and you know what's interesting? Now, this might be interesting. If I follow the human spirit, what's going to happen? See that? Why is that happening? The way it works. The way it works. Let me tell you about the critical interface. If you're going to remember anything about this morning, this might be it. The critical interface spiritually is the Spirit of God communicating with your spirit. That's the critical interface. Here's why. Which of these represents the human spirit? The default human spirit. The default human spirit. How about the upgraded human spirit? The default human spirit. Angry, accusing, blaming, fearful. The upgraded human spirit. And again, this isn't natural. Do you know how the upgraded spirit, human spirit, gets that way? By connecting with the Spirit of God. You're going to say to yourself what you hear said. Now again, this might be interesting. This might be interesting. If you conceive of God saying, who in the world, you, what are you going to say to yourself? Who in the world, you. And you're going to say to yourself what you conceive of him saying to you. What if you start to conceive because the Spirit is convincing you that you're his child? What's going to happen if you start to see things scary in yourself? You know what you're going to say to yourself? Calm down. You know what's going to happen if you do that? You draw closer to him and to one another. It's the way it works. The way it works. The Spirit of God will not use fear to motivate obedience. What it says, look what it says in Romans 8:15. Again, this is one of those verses that if you want to know about what the Spirit of God, what his influence is like, this verse says a bunch. You did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received the spirit of sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. Do you know what that verse is saying? The Spirit of God will not use fear to motivate obedience. Will not. You did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear. You received a spirit of sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit of God is not a spirit who... So, why do people who represent God want to scare us. Those who represent God will not use fear to motivate obedience. They won't. And again, there's people that use fear to motivate obedience. They're not reflecting the Spirit of God. Again, I'm not judging individuals. I'm just saying on the basis of what we know from the Bible, the Spirit is not a spirit that makes us a slave again to fear. Seventh sense, the divine spirit upgrades the human spirit. The upgraded human spirit unites us with the Father and his children. Look what it says in Galatians 4:4-7. God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those under law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. Because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And since you are a son, God has made you also an heir. Since we're children, God sends, how does this work? The seventh sense is the Spirit, the sense by which we conceive of and connect with God. You know what I think? Now catch this. This is really tricky. Graphic magic. Ooh. Do you know what he sends within us? You know what the divine spirit is? It's the spirit of his Son. It's the spirit of Jesus. That's who the divine spirit is. You know why Jesus loved the Father? He had the Spirit, because the Spirit, the way he conceived of the Father. How is God going to enable you to be more like Jesus? Put the Spirit of Jesus inside. I want you to imagine, I can't play the piano. If I jump over to there, I'm not gonna go yet anything, am I? I can't play. I'd like to play like Mozart, maybe. It would be interesting, and this can't happen. What if the spirit of Mozart came into me? What if that happened? And I would think and see and imagine and envision like him. In time, I'd be able to play like him because the Spirit comes into me. You know how God makes you more like Jesus? Puts the Spirit of Jesus into you. You know what the Spirit of Jesus is like? The Spirit of Jesus wouldn't distance you from the Father, would it? Would the Spirit of Jesus distance you from other people? No. Or would the Spirit of Jesus connect you with the Father? And would the Spirit of Jesus draw you to other people? Pretty simple, isn't it? You know what the divine Spirit is? And again, it's the Spirit of his Son. This is how God unites us with himself and with his children. He upgrades the human spirit by sending the Spirit of his Son in to tutor it. And you know what his Spirit says? Shh. He's your Father. You don't need to be afraid of him. You don't need to be afraid of the Father. That's what Jesus wants to tell you. And you know what's going to happen as you believe it? You're going to become more Christ-like. You have not received a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear. You've received the spirit of sonship. By him we cry, Abba, Father. You know what I'd say? If you hear fearful messages, turn the radio off. I don't care if it's KNWC. I don't care what it is. And again, I'm not... Just understand what the Spirit sounds like. And don't stay in that place. It's not him. The upgraded human spirit unites us with the Father and his children. Look what it says, 1 Corinthians 3. By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation, Paul writes, as an expert builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should be careful how he builds. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If a man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each man's work. If what he has built survives, he will receive his reward. If it is burned up, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but only as one escaping through the flames. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple. This verse is used to scare people. It's used to say, I'll tell you what, if you're smoking, if you destroy God's temple, God's going to destroy you. And it's used to lead you to believe that at some point in the future you're going to appear before God, and he's going to look at what you've done, and he's going to set you on fire. And if good things you did, then you're going to survive that. You know what this thing is? This passage is targeting people in positions of spiritual leadership. That's what it's targeting. Paul talks about himself as a master builder. Someone else is building on the foundation that he created, and some individuals are coming into his churches and are making people afraid in order to get them to obey. And Paul is saying, watch out, people in positions of spiritual leadership. Watch out how you're building. If you use methods and means that God doesn't use, then your work is really not going to last. That's what he's saying. He's calling into question Christian workers and saying some of their work might not last. Now, some of them don't know any better. And that's why he says, you will survive, but as one escaping through the flames. So there's individuals at that time who didn't know any better. And they made people afraid and frightened them. And Paul says, okay, some of you don't know, and your work's going to get burned up, but you're going to be okay. Some other people were not so innocent. They knew better. They knew better, or should have. And when it says, if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is sacred, it's not blowing up people who smoke. Here's what this is saying. Somebody who walks into a place uses influence that frightens people to death, because when you frighten people to death, what happens to people who distance from God? They divide. Do you know what this does? It destroys a body. Divide, divide. The more we go away from him, the more we divide from one another. And then we're making people afraid, be afraid of God. And what happens when that happens? They destroy the body. That's what he's talking about. It's talking about that individual who brings that influence. And Paul says, if anyone destroys God's temple, that's important to God. And God's going to destroy him, those who will wittingly. See, this verse is proclaimed by those sitting up front as, you better be afraid. Do you know what this verse is not written to? It's not written to you. It's written to people like me. And saying, if you do this, do you understand? Does that make sense? That is what this text is saying. This text is about people exercising spiritual leadership. And if you hear somebody using this verse to try to get you to be afraid, what am I going to tell you to do? Walk out the door or turn off the radio. And am I kidding? No, because this is serious. And again, I'm not going to jump up. But there's a lot at stake. We have a tendency, because the default human spirit, you know what it hears stuff like this, and you know where it says? Amen, that's right. The default human spirit is angry. You remember that? And what the Spirit tries to do is go, Some of you are very harsh with yourself. Terrible with yourself. And you imagine that comes from the Spirit of God. You know what he's saying? Gentle. Go this way. Because as you move towards him, it will give you the ability to move towards one another. Saw a couple things. The Spirit of God and the worship team's going to come up. We're going to continue to talk about the seventh sense. And we learned a couple things today. In terms of review, do you remember what the human spirit does? The default human spirit? Do you remember that? What does it do? Relative to him? And when it does this, it does this. What does the upgraded human spirit do? The opposite. I just got it.